What happens when one of Britain's most beloved comedic actors faces off against a talk show panel that refuses to back down? In just 32 seconds, a simple conversation turned into one of the most shocking exits in British television history. Before we dive into this unbelievable confrontation, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the feuds they don't want you to see, and the moments that get buried by the media machine. Hit that subscribe button now because you won't want to miss what happens next. Last night on Loose Women, what started as a light conversation quickly descended into absolute chaos. Rowan Atkinson, the legendary actor known for his sharp wit and brilliant comedy, sat across from the panel with what appeared to be a pleasant smile. But beneath that calm exterior, tensions were already beginning to simmer. The studio lights were bright as always, the audience packed in tight, ready for their usual dose of celebrity chat and light banter. Nobody in that room could have predicted what was about to unfold. The panel welcomed him warmly at first. Denise Welch, sitting in the center position, led the conversation with her characteristic boldness. She looked confident, prepared, with a stack of notes sitting on the table in front of her. The other panelists smiled and nodded along as they discussed Rowan's incredible career spanning decades. They talked about his iconic characters, his contribution to British comedy, and his recent projects. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The audience clapped politely. The atmosphere felt relaxed and friendly. They went through the usual questions. How did he prepare for his roles? What was his favorite project? Did he have any funny stories from set? Rowan answered each question with grace and humor, the way he'd done 1,000 times before on 1,000 different shows. His responses were charming, self-deprecating, and entertaining. The audience laughed at all the right moments. The panelists smiled and nodded enthusiastically. It all seemed so routine, so predictable. He told a particularly funny story about a mishap on set that had everyone in stitches. The cameras caught him in his element, animated and engaged, doing what he does best. For those first 10 minutes, it was exactly what everyone expected from a Rowan Atkinson appearance. Light, funny, entertaining, easy television. But if you watched closely, you could see something else happening. Denise kept glancing down at her notes with a particular expression on her face. She was waiting for something, building up to something. The friendly questions were just the warm-up act. The real show was about to begin. Her body language shifted slightly. She sat up straighter. Her smile became more fixed, less genuine. About 10 minutes into the interview, the shift happened. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. Denise's smile changed slightly. Her tone shifted just a fraction. She glanced at her fellow panelists, and something unspoken passed between them. You could almost see them mentally preparing for what came next. Then the conversation took an unexpected turn. Denise leaned forward with a curious expression and brought up a topic that immediately shifted the energy in the studio. She mentioned some comments Rowan had made years ago about freedom of speech and comedy in modern times. Her tone changed slightly, becoming more pointed and direct. The smile on Rowan's face didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. He knew exactly where this was going. "You've been quite vocal about your views on what comedians should and shouldn't be allowed to say," Denise said, her voice carrying an edge that wasn't there moments before. "Some people feel like you're defending outdated attitudes. What do you say to those critics?" Rowan shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened just a fraction. You could see him choosing his words carefully, trying to navigate this sudden minefield. The friendly atmosphere had evaporated completely. "I think there's a difference between defending harmful behavior and defending the principle that comedy should have room to breathe," he replied carefully. "Context matters enormously in comedy. Always has, always will." The other panelists exchanged quick glances. One of them jumped in, backing up Denise's line of questioning. Her voice was sweet, but there was steel underneath. "But don't you think some things have changed? That what was acceptable before just isn't anymore?" Rowan nodded slowly, maintaining his composure. He was trying to be diplomatic, trying to keep things civil. Of course, things change. Society evolves. But the fundamental principle that comedy requires a degree of freedom to function, that hasn't changed. Comedy has always pushed boundaries. That's literally the point of it. Without that freedom, comedy becomes toothless. Denise wasn't satisfied with that answer. She pressed harder, her voice rising slightly. The politeness was dropping away now. revealing something sharper underneath. "So, you think comedians should just be able to say whatever they want, even if it hurts people?" "That's not what I said," Rowan responded, his own voice becoming firmer. He was getting frustrated now. You could hear it creeping into his tone. "You're twisting my words into something they're not. I never said comedians should be cruel or deliberately hurtful. But there's a massive difference between causing genuine harm and simply making someone uncomfortable. Comedy is supposed to make us think, sometimes by making us uncomfortable." The audience had gone quiet now. You could feel the atmosphere in the studio changing, like a storm building on the horizon. What started as a discussion was becoming something else entirely, something more confrontational, more personal. People in the audience were looking at each other, sensing that something was going very wrong very quickly. Another panelist chimed in, her voice dripping with skepticism. "But who gets to decide what's just uncomfortable versus what's actually harmful? Surely the people being affected by these jokes should have a say?" Rowan turned to address her directly. His patience was wearing thin, but he was still trying to maintain some semblance of civility. "Of course they should. And they do. They express their opinions. They vote with their wallets. They choose what to watch and what to avoid. But there's a difference between criticism and censorship. Between saying, 'I don't like this,' and saying, 'Nobody should be allowed to say this.'" Denise leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Her body language had completely changed. The friendly host was gone. In her place was someone ready for a fight. Someone who had been waiting for this moment. "I think you're hiding behind this idea of artistic freedom to avoid taking responsibility. People have been genuinely hurt by things you've defended." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Rowan's expression hardened. The polite mask was beginning to crack. You could see the anger building behind his eyes. "I'm not hiding behind anything. And I find it quite rich that you're lecturing me about responsibility when you've built your entire career on saying provocative things and courting controversy." The audience gasped. This wasn't friendly banter anymore. This was real tension, real anger bubbling to the surface. The other panelists looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. The show's producers in the control room were probably having a meltdown, but the cameras kept rolling. This was gold for ratings, even if it was a nightmare for everyone involved. Denise's face flushed red. Her eyes flashed with genuine anger. She wasn't expecting him to come back at her like that. "Excuse me? How dare you come on this show and attack me personally when we're trying to have a legitimate conversation about accountability and entertainment? You started with the personal attacks." Rowan shot back, his voice sharp now, cutting through the studio like a knife. His composure was slipping further with each exchange. "You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work, and instead you've ambushed me with a moral inquisition. This isn't a conversation. This is a bloody trial." One of the other panelists tried to calm things down. Her voice was gentle, soothing, trying to pour water on the fire. "Let's all just take a breath here. Maybe we can—" But Denise wasn't finished. She talked over her colleague, her focus entirely on Rowan. Her voice had taken on a hard edge, all pretense of civility abandoned. "A trial? You think this is a trial? We're asking you basic questions about your public statements. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be making those statements in the first place." Rowan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was bitter and frustrated, the laugh of someone who'd had enough. "I can handle questions just fine. What I can't handle is being deliberately misrepresented by someone who clearly made up their mind about me before I even walked through that door. You're not interested in my answers. You're interested in making me look bad." This whole thing was a setup from the start. The tension in the studio was suffocating now. Every person in the audience sat frozen, watching this confrontation unfold in real time. The cameras captured every moment, every angry expression, every sharp word. Social media was probably already exploding with clips and reactions. This was the kind of television moment that people would be talking about for weeks. A third panelist, who had been quiet until now, decided to jump into the fray. "I think what Denise is trying to say, Rowan, is that words have consequences. And when someone with your platform defends certain positions, it emboldens others who might use that as justification for genuinely harmful behavior." Rowan turned his attention to her, his frustration evident. "I understand that words have consequences. I've spent my entire career choosing words very carefully. But you're conflating things that shouldn't be conflated. Defending the principle of free expression is not the same as endorsing every single thing that gets expressed. Can you not see that distinction? But it feels like you're more concerned with defending the rights of comedians to offend than you are with the people being offended, the panelist countered. That's because one of those things is actually under threat, Rowan replied, his voice rising with passion. Nobody is trying to take away people's right to be offended. Nobody is saying you can't criticize comedy. But there are absolutely people trying to decide what comedians can and cannot say, what topics are completely off limits, what jokes should get people fired or canceled or removed from platforms entirely. Denise jumped back in, her voice sharp and accusatory. Oh, here we go. The classic cancel culture defense. Maybe if people are facing consequences for their actions, it's because those actions were wrong in the first place. Or maybe, Rowan countered, his patience clearly wearing thin, it's because we've created an environment where a vocal minority can destroy someone's career over a joke they didn't like, without any nuance or context or consideration for intent. That's not accountability. That's mob justice. The studio erupted with murmurs. Some audience members nodded in agreement. Others shook their heads disapprovingly. The panelists were all talking at once now, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disagreement. Denise raised her voice above the others. Mob justice? You're sitting here, still working, still getting opportunities, still being invited on television shows. You're hardly a victim. I never claimed to be a victim, Rowan said, his voice dangerously quiet now. But I've seen what happens to others. I've watched careers destroyed, reputations ruined, people driven out of the industry entirely for telling jokes that someone somewhere found offensive. And the fact that you can't even acknowledge that as a problem speaks volumes. Another panelist interjected, trying a different approach. But Rowan, don't you think there's a difference between edgy comedy that challenges societal norms and comedy that simply punches down at vulnerable groups? Of course there's a difference, Rowan replied, sounding exhausted. But who gets to decide which is which? Who appointed you as the arbiter of what's acceptable? Comedy is subjective. What one person finds hilarious, another finds offensive. That's always been the case. The solution isn't to ban everything that might offend someone. The solution is to allow different voices, different perspectives, and let audiences decide what they want to consume. Denise shook her head vigorously. That's a cop-out, and you know it. Some things are objectively harmful. Some jokes are objectively wrong. And hiding behind "it's subjective" is just an excuse to avoid accountability. There you go with accountability again, Rowan said, his frustration boiling over. You keep using that word, but what you really mean is conformity. You want everyone to think exactly like you do, to share your exact values, your exact sensibilities, and anyone who doesn't is branded as problematic or dangerous or needs to be held accountable. The audience was completely divided now. You could hear people arguing with each other in the seats. The energy in the studio had shifted from shocked silence to barely controlled chaos. This had gone far beyond a typical talk show disagreement. This was personal. This was ugly. Denise stood up from her chair, pointing a finger at Rowan. Her voice was shaking with emotion. That is absolute nonsense. We invited you here in good faith, and you're the one who came in with an attitude. You're the one who can't take a bit of criticism without throwing a tantrum. Rowan stood up as well, facing her directly. His usual calm demeanor had completely evaporated. A tantrum? This is what you call a tantrum? I'm defending myself against your deliberate mischaracterizations. There's a difference between criticism and character assassination, and you bloody well know it. The other panelists were on their feet now too, trying to physically position themselves between Rowan and Denise. The situation was spiraling completely out of control. The studio audience didn't know whether to gasp or applaud. Some people looked genuinely shocked. Others seemed thrilled by the drama unfolding before them. This was reality television at its most raw and unfiltered. Character assassination, Denise shouted, her voice echoing through the studio. You're the one who came on national television, defending indefensible positions. You're the one who thinks comedy gives you a free pass to say whatever the hell you want. I never said that, Rowan's voice rose to match hers, his composure completely shattered now. Not once have I ever said that. But you keep putting those words in my mouth because it fits your narrative. You don't care about the truth. You just want your moment. Your clip that goes viral. Your proof that you stood up to someone. Well, congratulations, Denise. You got your moment. Denise took a step closer, her finger still pointed accusingly. Don't you dare try to make this about me. This is about you, and your refusal to acknowledge that times have changed. That the things you defend are harmful. That your precious artistic freedom isn't more important than people's dignity and safety. Safety? Rowan's voice dripped with disbelief. Safety? We're talking about comedy, not physical violence. Words aren't violence, no matter how much you want to pretend they are. And the fact that you can't distinguish between actual harm and hurt feelings is exactly why this conversation is impossible. One of the other panelists grabbed Denise's arm, trying to pull her back. Denise, maybe we should... But Denise shrugged her off, completely focused on Rowan. Hurt feelings? You think this is just about hurt feelings? People have lost jobs, been harassed, been driven to depression and worse because of the kind of rhetoric you defend. But sure, dismiss it all as hurt feelings. Rowan's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, not in a threatening way, but in a way that showed just how hard he was trying to maintain control. You're conflating comedy with harassment. You're conflating jokes with targeted attacks. You're deliberately blurring all the lines to make your point, and it's intellectually dishonest. Intellectually dishonest? Denise's voice went up another octave. You're calling me intellectually dishonest? That's rich coming from someone who uses their intelligence to justify punching down at vulnerable people. There you go again, Rowan exploded. Putting words in my mouth. When have I ever advocated for punching down? When have I ever said comedians should target vulnerable people? You're creating a straw man version of my position, and then attacking that instead of what I actually believe. The studio was in complete pandemonium now. Audience members were shouting. The other panelists were trying desperately to restore order. Camera operators were zooming in, capturing every second of this meltdown. This was the kind of television that would be replayed and analyzed for months to come. Denise's hands were shaking with anger. Her face was red, her eyes blazing. Get out. If you're going to stand there and insult me and insult this show, then get the hell out. The words cut through the chaos like a guillotine. Everything went quiet for just a moment. Rowan stared at her, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. With pleasure, Rowan finally said, his voice cold and controlled now. The anger was still there, but it had transformed into something icier, something more dangerous. I should never have agreed to come here in the first place. This isn't journalism. This isn't even entertainment. This is just a platform for you to attack people who don't share your exact worldview. He reached up and unclipped his microphone, the small technical gesture somehow feeling incredibly significant in this moment. The sound of the clip coming undone seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. His hands moved deliberately, carefully, as he removed the device and set it down on the chair he'd been sitting in. Denise wasn't done. Even as Rowan was preparing to leave, she kept going. Her voice was shrill now, desperate almost. That's right, run away. Run away when someone actually challenges you for once. Rowan turned back to face her one last time. His eyes were blazing, but his voice was steady. I'm not running from a challenge. I'm walking away from a circus. There's a difference, though I wouldn't expect you to understand it. A circus? Denise laughed, but it was a harsh, ugly sound. You're the one making a scene. You're the one who couldn't handle a simple conversation without losing your temper. Simple conversation? Rowan's voice rose again despite his attempt at control. You ambushed me with loaded questions, twisted everything I said, and then acted shocked when I defended myself. This was never meant to be a conversation. This was an execution, and you were the executioner. The other panelists tried one last time to salvage the situation. One of them stepped forward, her hands raised placatingly. Rowan, please, let's just sit down and talk about this calmly. We can start over. Have a real discussion. But he was already moving toward the exit. His footsteps echoed across the stage as he walked with purpose, his back straight, his jaw set. Every eye in the studio was on him. The cameras followed his every movement. capturing the moment from multiple angles. The audience sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Denise called after him, her voice carrying across the studio. "This is live television. You can't just walk off. You signed a contract. You have an obligation." Rowan didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply kept walking, past the cameras, past the shocked crew members, past the set decorations and the bright lights. His pace never faltered. His determination never wavered. "Rowan!" Denise shouted again, taking a few steps in his direction. "Come back here. We're not finished." He paused for just a second at the edge of the set. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around, might have one final thing to say. But then he shook his head slightly, as if deciding it wasn't worth it, and continued walking. Within seconds, he had disappeared through the side door, leaving the panel sitting in absolute chaos. The door closed behind him with an emphatic slam that resonated through the entire studio. It was final, definitive, the sound of a bridge being burned in real time. The remaining panelists looked at each other, their faces showing a mixture of shock, confusion, and uncertainty. Denise stood there, her chest heaving with anger and adrenaline, staring at the door where Rowan had just exited. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, as if she wanted to say something else, but no words came out. The studio audience began to murmur, whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People were pulling out their phones, already typing furiously, already sharing what they just witnessed. The producers in the control room were probably in full panic mode, trying to figure out how to handle this disaster. For several long seconds, nobody on the panel knew what to say. The show was still live, the cameras were still rolling, but their guest was gone, and the friendly morning talk show had just witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in its history. One of the panelists finally found her voice, attempting to address the camera with a shaky smile. "Well, that certainly wasn't what we expected this morning." Another panelist tried to add some levity. "I think we all need a cup of tea and a moment to process what just happened." But Denise remained standing, her eyes still fixed on that exit door, her hands still trembling slightly. The shock on her face suggested that even she hadn't anticipated things escalating quite this far, quite this fast. She'd wanted a confrontation, sure. She'd wanted to challenge him. But this had gone beyond anything she could have imagined. The audience was getting louder now. People talking among themselves, debating what they'd seen, taking sides. Half the room seemed to be Team Rowan, arguing that he'd been ambushed and had every right to walk off. The other half was Team Denise, insisting that he'd shown his true colors by refusing to answer difficult questions. One of the panelists gently touched Denise's arm. "Maybe we should cut to commercial." Denise nodded numbly, still staring at that door. A crew member counted them down, and the show cut to a break, but the damage was done. The genie was out of the bottle. The footage was already out there, already being shared and dissected and memed. The show cut to a commercial break, but everyone knew that the advertisements were just a temporary reprieve. When they came back, they would have to address what had just happened. They would have to try to explain the inexplicable. In just 32 seconds of brutal back and forth, a simple interview had exploded into a full-scale confrontation that would dominate headlines and social media for days to come. Rowan Atkinson had walked onto that stage as a welcomed guest. He walked off it as someone who had just participated in one of the most dramatic exits British television had ever seen. The door swung shut behind him with a heavy thud that seemed to punctuate the entire disastrous encounter. Inside the studio, the panelists tried to regain their composure. Outside, Rowan Atkinson kept walking, never looking back, leaving behind a stunned studio and a television moment that nobody would forget anytime soon.